So we will begin. So welcome again. It's our morning Bible study from the book of Genesis. So we're at Santa Cruz Community Church. I'm John Heberling, the retired pastor and teacher of the Bible. So I want to start out again with kind of cautioning us that with how we see things as we're reading these Old Testament stories. On the one hand, we don't want to get all self-righteous and start judging these things we see them doing by our modern standards, modern Christian standards, and sort of figure that these patriarchs are really very poor class people. On the other hand, we don't want to start thinking, well, now these are God's people, so everything they do is good. These are children of grace like we are. God is working with them, beginning a plan that's going to change the world in many years ahead. But he works with what he has. And we looked at Abraham and Isaac. Abraham, for the most part, is a very respected person. He's most of what we see Abraham doing. His attitudes are encouraging to us. He is kind of a role model, and yet he's not perfect. He's chosen and offered this covenant with God by God's grace. We don't want to get the idea, some have talked about, that well, all the grace is in the New Testament. There's nothing but judgment in the Old Testament. No, God is pretty gracious to a lot of these Old Testament people. Now, Abraham sets he's the main character of the book of Genesis, and he sets an interesting pattern for us as we follow his life. Then Isaac is a good son, following in his father's footsteps for the most part. And yet, as we were seeing Isaac and Rebekah last time, and the birth of the twins, Jacob and Esau, we immediately began to see some real flaws in the family life there, and we should. I mean, as we're reading Genesis, we're wanting to get acquainted with the ways of God, to be introduced to who God really is, but we also are being introduced to who humans really are, and we see ourselves in the book. So we see Isaac and Rebekah as they mature and the boys grow up. We see a kind of a typical family situation that's not good, where Esau is the outdoorsman, he's the man's man, he's out hunting game, and his father loves him. So he's his father's favorite. Jacob, on the other hand, is a homeboy, hangs around the house, seems to get into cooking. He's his mother's favorite. And we think, this idea of favoritism is a pitfall. I also see, as we move on, there's kind of a pattern here that Grandpa Abraham sets some good, clear standards of relationship with God. Isaac walks pretty much in his father's footsteps. There's a lot about Isaac that I admire. He's a peaceable man, he's a patient man, a loving man.
Just like you.
There you are. But then when we get to Jacob, the grandson, this you say, I know that pattern. The grandson is sort of doing his own thing. And we see ourselves more in Jacob. So the familiar story last time is as part of Isaac's story, but it's also the beginning of Jacob's story. That Jacob hanging around home, Esau out hunting game, and Esau comes in. He didn't have a good hunt. He didn't take enough food with him. He thinks he's starving to death. He's, this this kind of a guy that when things aren't going his way, he's really unhappy about it. So he comes in and he sees Jacob cooking some lentil stew there out. I mean, they don't always cook right in the kitchen. He's out in the courtyard somewhere. And Esau says to him, give me some of that good food because I'm about to die. And Jacob says, this is not terribly admirable on our part. Sell me first your birthright, because Esau was born first of the twins. You think, well, twins are born at the same time. Well, no, one of them's got to be first. So Esau is the firstborn. And Jacob says, sell me your birthright. And Esau says, what good's a birthright when I'm dying? So give me some of the food. And Jacob says, well, swear to me first that you're going to sell me your birthright. And Esau says, sure, why not? And the chapter ends saying, so Esau despised his birthright. He had no sense of the value of this, no sense of what was happening in their larger lives. Jacob seems to, and yet, as believers in God, we always have this thing of mixed motives. And you see sometimes what looks like godliness is really selfishness. And so Jacob seems to, at this point, have this idea of, I want that birthright. I want to be God's man. And yet, as you see the story unfolding, you feel like, though Jacob wants to have the inheritance, he wants to be the boss. He wants to, instead of being the little brother, become the big brother. And interestingly, this kind of confuses us at times. When the two boys were kind of competing already in the womb, poor Rebecca was saying, oh my gosh, what is happening here? And so she goes and talks to God about it. And God says to her, yes, there is a struggle within your womb. There's two different peoples there, and they're going to be at odds with each other. And he makes this startling prediction. He says, but the older will serve the younger. Now, that's not the way it's supposed to be. The firstborn is supposed to be the primary child in the family, the primary son, and he should be the boss. And yet God says, no, the younger one is going to be predominant here. Okay, so then we follow this story along until Isaac is old and his eyesight is failing, and now, if you think Isaac's about to die, 20 years later when Jacob gets back, Isaac is still alive. He just feels like he's going to die. You understand that? Some of us do. So he says, well, who knows when I'm going to die, so I better settle my affairs here. And the tradition is, where did this tradition come from? I was reading I have a Bible that has all kinds of archaeological notes in it. And in this Bible, it talks about the archaeologists finding two major communities up there where Abraham's family came from, and doing a lot of research on them and finding tablets that they can read the messages on. So they're comparing what they're finding in archaeology with what's in the Bible. And it's interesting that a lot of these things that we read in the Bible and think, well, that's odd, where did that come from? The archaeologists said, no, that was the culture. That's what everybody was thinking and doing. So Isaac thinks he's close to dying, and the tradition is, and this seems to have God behind it, that before the father dies, he's supposed to give a blessing to his sons, especially to his primary son. And this blessing is prophetic. It's God acting through this. So Isaac calls Esau, who's his favorite, and says, go out and catch some game and fix me one of those good meals that you do that I like so much. Put the Barbie on here, Esau. Make me some good men's food. Bring it to me and I will give you my blessing. So Esau takes his bow and arrow and off he goes to hunt game. But Mom, Rebecca, is saying, no, I don't think that's the way it's going to be. And she's listening to this conversation. So she calls Jacob and says to him, your father says he's going to bless Esau, so you go get me a couple of goats, young goats, and I'll make it taste just like it was deer or whatever it is that Esau's going to cook. I know what your father likes. I'll fix it. Just the way he likes it. And you go in and you get the blessing. And Jacob says, how can I do that? You know, he'll know the difference. He may be blind, but he's not dumb. Esau is a hairy man, and I'm a smooth skinned man. And Esau's a man of the field, and I'm a man of the house. How's he going to? And she says, trust me, son, do what I say. I'll fix this. So it's mom and boy here. We sort of blame Jacob, but it really is Rebecca who sets this thing up. She fixes the food very quickly for him. And then she takes some of the goat skin, she puts it on his hands and on his neck so that if his father feels him, he'll feel hairiness like the goat. And she dresses him in Esau's clothes so he'll smell like Esau. So Jacob comes in with his food and he says, here, father, who says that? He says, I'm your son Esau. So he lies, he just flat out lies. And Isaac is a little puzzled by this, and so he keeps asking him, who really? Who are you? I'm Esau. How did you get this food so quickly? You were supposed to go out and catch game. It should have taken longer. No, God blessed me, Jacob says. Gave me quick response to my hunting. So anyway, Isaac still, he touches him. He says, well, so it seems like Esau's hands. He smells, he says, smells like Esau. He says, I don't understand. It's Jacob's voice, but it's Esau. So anyway, finally, Isaac says, okay. And he gives him this blessing. And the blessing says, you will rule, you'll be the inheritor. As we read it, the blessing has a lot to do with what God gave Abraham and then passed on to Isaac, and now is passing on to Jacob and through Jacob to a larger family. But I'm not sure how much Jacob really understood all of that. So what I'm wanting you to share with me this morning as we go further is, tell me what you see in Jacob and his attitudes and what he says and does. So anyway, after Jacob has just gotten his things gathered up and gotten out of there, when here comes Esau with his food. And Isaac says, who are you? He says, I'm Esau. Well, then who was that I just blessed? And Esau says, give me a blessing. No, the blessing's given. I can't take it back. In effect, I'm interpreting, you understand. You read what the text says, but I'm interpreting it. So Esau says, don't you have any blessing for me? And Isaac says, yes, you'll have a good life and good blessings, but you will serve your brother. So Esau doesn't take this very well. He's a man's man. He's angry. He's big and strong, and he says, okay, that's the way it's going to be. Dad is old. He's going to die. When Dad dies, I'm going to kill that brother of mine. And Mom hears it, and she says, we got to fix this. So she goes to, now Esau has already married a couple of the local girls whose lifestyle and ways of thinking and doing are nothing like God's people are supposed to be. So she goes to Isaac, and she says, Isaac, my dear husband, we don't want Jacob to marry one of these local girls like Esau has. Those girls are just too much. I can't stand it. They're driving me crazy. What do I do if Jacob marries one of them? And Isaac says, yeah, I think you're right. I think probably, so he calls Jacob and he says, don't marry one of these local girls, one of these Canaanite girls or Hittite girls. go back to the home country up there. It's called Padam Aram. A lot of my archaeologists say, we're not sure what they mean by that. They could mean that it's a sort of a fertile plain up there, and that's what it means, or it may mean it's on the main trade routes. Sometimes when you have different languages going on, the scholars are not just sure what a word actually means. But anyway, back up there where the rest of the family is, and find a wife there. Isaac is sort of saying, like I did, like Abraham sent his servant to find Rebekah for me up there with the other old family. Now, the old family has some of the ways, the culture that's developing here, and yet the old family are not, they know something about God, they talk about God. So we're a step ahead with them rather than the Canaanites and the Hivites who already are deep into idolatry. But they're not really with God where Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are supposed to be. So anyway, Jacob hurries out of there when he hears that his brother's planning to kill him. Fortunately, Dad's still alive, so he has some time, but he hurries out of there. I'm not sure how he packed for this trip. You know, now we would see him with a backpack with his few belongings stuck in it. But anyway, he takes to the road. I'm not sure how early in the day he starts. He travels about 75 miles or so this first day from way down toward the desert, toward Egypt, where his father's camp is. Isaac seemed to move deeper into the wilderness from where Abraham was. Abraham is a Hebron. Isaac is deeper into the wilderness than that. So anyway, then he passes where Jerusalem will be later. It's still just one of the pagan cities at that point. It's the city of Salem where Melchizedek came out to bless Abraham. That was interesting and puzzling. He goes further, and the text says Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. Haran is the village where his people live. When he reached a certain place, now that certain place kind of caught me, because if you go back to Abraham's story, you remember Abraham leaves Ur of the Chaldees and they go up to the headlands. They find this nice land up there in the headlands of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. And they settle down. And even though we're told that God had said to Abraham, leave all your family and go where I show you, he gets this far and he stops until his father dies. And then God says again, now, leave your family and go where I show you. And now Abraham does go, chapter 12 of Genesis. And as he goes, he gets into kind of the middle of this country that we call the Holy Lands, or Palestine, or Canaan, all these different names that it has. He gets kind of in the middle of it, and he finds a place that he stops for some reason. And we're told that he stops between Bethel and Ai. Now we want to notice that, because it's actually Jacob who names this place Bethel. So you don't want to get confused. Sometimes the later writers call things by the name that they get later, but that wasn't what it was called then. So Abraham builds an altar here and worships God. So it's kind of like, okay, God, I've left. He did take Lot with him, which we talked about being a problem. But I'm here in the land that you sent me to. So he builds an altar and he worships God. And I'm not sure this certain place thing, whether the writer writing this is calling our attention to the fact that Jacob accidentally or on purpose or by God's design stops somewhat at the same place that Abraham had stopped. Abraham is coming in, Jacob is going out, but it's the same place. And he's tired, he's hurried all day, he's put his brother somewhat behind him. He's probably lonesome. I was reading J. Vernon McGee. J. Vernon McGee's a great storyteller. And he really makes this come to life. He says, think about it. You remember when you were young and you were leaving home and everything about life was there at home, especially was for Jacob. His mother and the tents of home. And all of a sudden, it's just him. He's all by himself. Going where he doesn't know where he's going. I presume that his mother has told him exactly where he's going, since it was her homeland, because he seems to know where to go when he gets there. But here, this first night, the sun's gone down, so he stops to rest, and he takes a stone and uses it for a pillow, and right away we say, what? You don't use a stone for a pillow, you want a pillow to be soft. Well, my footnotes, the archaeologists tell me that ancient people slept on the ground, they didn't sleep in beds, and so you needed to prop your head up, so they took something fairly hard and propped their head up. Sometimes the Egyptians had a kind of a headpiece that was like a pillow, but it was really something hard. Now I'm thinking, well, Jacob maybe took this stone and then put some padding on top of it. At any rate, he lays down to rest in this certain place. Now, the text does not say it's where Abraham was, but that he reached a certain place kind of makes me remember that that's where Abraham stopped. He stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones, and J. Vernon McGee talks about being on a trip to the Holy Land when he was a younger guy, and he wanted to go visit this place where Abraham was and where Jacob was. And the bus driver, the group he was with, wouldn't take him there, but he got close enough to see the place, and he said it was kind of a rocky area. There were a lot of big stones around. So anyway, other than that, he said it looked pretty desolate. You know, he's from greener pastures, and this is kind of semi-arid country. So he puts his head on the stone and he goes to sleep. He's tired. But J. Vernon McGee says, wouldn't he have been lonely? Wouldn't he have been homesick? When I'm reading J. Vernon McGee, I'm thinking about, I was a camp counselor a lot in my early days. And we'd take the kids from home and take them to camp. Some of these kids had never been away from home a night in their lives. And you expected the first night or so to have homesickness. You'd be sitting up talking to some kid who's crying and saying, I don't want to stay here, I want to go home, won't you take me home? No, you'll feel better tomorrow, stay, you know. So anyway, Jacob is asleep and he has a dream. Now, I have dreams, but I'm glad my dreams don't come true. I'm always glad when I wake up in the morning and think, okay, I don't have to think about that anymore. That was just a dream. But Jacob has a different kind of a dream. And apparently we see these dreams. Joseph has dreams that you know are not just a dream. There's something with a message in it. Later, Jacob, the father of Jesus, stepfather of Jesus, has dreams. So he has a dream, and in the dream, he saw a stairway. Now, the old translation says a ladder. I don't know whether you go back far enough to sing the song, "We are climbing Jacob's ladder." But the archaeologists remind me that the culture of the day, going back to that Tower of Babel, that where God said, no, you can't all stay together, you're just making things worse. But they built these, what they called zuggonots, a tall tower. The taller your tower, the better. They were trying to get up where God is. They had no sense of the universe as we would see it. There's the clouds and the stars, and up there somewhere is God. And so they would have a stairway around this thing. So he says, Jacob sees this stairway resting on the earth, and at its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God are ascending and descending on it. There above it stood, and now we use this personal name of God, Yahweh, Lord God, Jehovah. And he said, I am Yahweh, I am the Lord God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. God is saying, Jacob, do you really realize who you are and what your heritage is, what this blessing was all about, what your life is about? I am the God of your grandfather Abraham and your father Isaac, and in effect, I want to be your God. I will give you, your descendants, the land. Now, God begins to talk to Jacob the same way he talked to Abraham and Isaac. I will give your descendants the land on which you're lying. You're right in the middle of this land. I'm going to give it all to you and your descendants. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring, your seed, Paul says. Really, he doesn't mean the multitude of people. He means one person, Jesus, who's going to come from you. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So God is saying, I know, son, grandson of Abraham, son of mine, I know what you're feeling and how fearful you are and how uncertain you are, and I want to tell you, I'm with you. You're not alone. I'm with you. I'm going to take you where you're supposed to go, and I'm going to bring you back, and I'm going to give you all these things that I promised Abraham and Isaac. When Jacob woke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place. That's a phrase we have in some of our music. And surely the Lord is in this place. And he says, and I was not aware of it. Now, what do you make of him saying, I didn't realize God was in this place? Now, we have to decide here, is there a special place? Is there something about this plot of ground that God has said, I'll be there? We more understand that God is everywhere. We don't have to go and find that plot of ground to find God. God finds us wherever we are. But to Jacob, it must be this place, this certain place that I landed in, that God is here. I didn't realize it, but I'm sleeping in God's spot. Very much similar to when Moses sees the burning bush and God says, take off your shoes. You're standing on holy ground. Wherever God is and wherever he confronts somebody is holy ground. He was afraid. Listen to that. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? What was his reaction to God? Well, he was afraid. He didn't really have this comfortable feeling about God. This is none other than the house of God. That's what Bethel means. Beth means house and El means God. This is the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. So, what do you think about young? He's not terribly young, but Jacob and this experience that he's had, seeing this ladder up to heaven and the angels going up and down. I was always puzzled by the fact that it says ascending and descending. Now we would think if we saw a ladder to heaven, the angels would all be coming down because that's where they live. And yet it says the angels were going up the ladder and coming down the ladder. But Jacob is not really thrilled with this. He's scared. He's saying, God has said, I'm going to be with you and take care of you. And Jacob is saying, what is this? I'm not comfortable with this. And yet he's moved by it. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. My archaeologists say that wasn't a strange thing for him to do. That was what all these people did. If there was some place they wanted to mark as special, they set up some kind of a stone that would remind them, and pouring oil on it had already become the sign of. Now we see this symbolism as it goes down through the centuries and comes to Jesus. The Messiah means the anointed one. This pouring of oil becomes symbolic of the Spirit of God coming upon something. I don't think that Jacob understood all that, but he understood that the custom was, what you do about a thing like this is you set up a stone and you pour oil on it and you say, I'm going to remember this place, this is special. So the stone that he slept on, where he had the dream, becomes special. And he sets it up and pours oil on it and set up a pillar. Now, there's such a thing I would mention just casually as what's called British Israelism, that says that really the British are the inheritors of all this Old Testament things. There are those who take it so far as to say that the people of Britain were the lost tribes of Israel. If you've done a little historic studying of how the people of Britain came to be there, you'd have a little trouble with that idea. But anyway, this stone, there used to be a tradition, didn't really search it out, that this stone was part of the British traditions and was under the throne of the kings and queens. I don't know anything about this stone really, nor does the Bible really point it out. The only place that you'd see this is in the 10th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And then the stone that Paul is talking about is not this stone, but the stone that the water came out of in the desert, a big stone. But anyway, he says the stone that followed them was Christ. So this stone becomes interesting, but he left it there. We'll see him go back there and probably find that stone later and see significance in it. But he called the place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. There was a village there close by that was then known as Luz, and it was until the time of Joshua, when they conquered the land. Then they found what they thought was this place, and they named it Bethel. But it becomes Bethel to the patriarchs right here when Jacob says this has got to be the house of God, and he names it Bethel. But it's close to a city that's called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow. Now, help me evaluate this. Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I'm taking, and will give me food and to eat and clothing to wear, so that I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord, Yahweh, will be my God. And the stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. How does that strike you? Does Jacob really understand what's going on, or is he trying to twist it around and make it his own thing? We have a lot of experiences of people that sometimes come to us. Maybe we've had them in our own life, where you get into some situation that's just so threatening, so impossible. And you say, oh God, if there is a God, if you're up there, if you'll get me out of this, I will serve you forever. And of course you get out of it and you say, oh, maybe God help me, and maybe I really need to pay attention to God. Or you say, Oh, I'm sorry, that didn't mean anything. I just it was the moment. So which do you see in Jacob here? If you will, now God said, I will go with you and I will take care of you. And Jacob says in his vow, if God goes with me and takes care of me and gives me food and clothing and brings me safely back to my father's house, you see where he doesn't really want to be where he's going. He wants to go back home.
It's interesting, he doesn't mention the wife. That's his mother's intent behind this, is that he'll get a wife, right?
No.
You know what strikes me too, John? We think of God as holy, just, and all that, and unable to tolerate sin, and yet here's Jacob. He's just lied to gain the inheritance, and all this deceit on the mother's part, and God embraces him as his own, and it just seems so unlike our vision of God. He would punish or whatever for sinning by lying and deceiving, and
that's what I was talking about in the introduction, Ed, that you could do. Those who've been in my classes for a while, I know I've always got this illustration that you're going across the ravine, across the bridge. You can fall off the left side or the right side and you're just as dead. So you can go one way or the other in this. You can either be so strongly moved to one side, so exceedingly to one side that you really fall off and lose it all, or you can go the other way and pay no attention to it and fall off. So Jacob is kind of in the middle of this, and this is where, to judge him too harshly and make ourselves look good would be probably a foolish thing to do. And yet not to see that there are moral lessons here, that God is dealing with human beings that are not what we would want them to be or what he wants them to be. And it's not that Jacob was so good that he became the last of the patriarchs. It's that God was so gracious to him, that God rescued him. God hears this vow and he says, okay, I said I was going to take care of you. And in spite of your fuzzy thinking, I will take care of you. But Jacob is, and then he says, of all you give me, I will give you a tenth. We go back to Abraham giving a tenth to Melchizedek, and this is the second time this tenth is mentioned. Now, let me make just a quick comment about that this becomes interesting, that when you think in terms of giving to God, that this idea of a tenth it's a big challenge. I remember people coming to me when I was a young pastor and saying, I try to give a tenth, but I just can't. It's just too much. What should I do? And I reminded them that there's nothing in the New Testament that ever says that a Christian is expected to tithe. Tithing was an Old Testament thing. And when we read stories of people that God has greatly blessed, we're impressed with the fact that pretty soon they began to say to themselves, 10% is not enough. And they gave 20%, 30%. We're told that people like J.C. Penney eventually gave 90% to God and kept 10% for themselves. But the 10% is an interesting thing, and it's built into the law. It was significant. Jesus says, you're so careful about tithing, you count the tiniest of seeds and you take them out of the garden, 1/10 goes to God. But he says, what about the bigger issues of the law? Grace and mercy and justice. So anyway, tithing is interesting. Did Jacob ever give a tithe to God? I can't find it in the text. It never says what, and if he did, who did he give it to? Abraham gave a tithe to Melchizedek. And the book of Hebrews says, symbolically, Abraham was acknowledging that there is someone closer to God than I am. So he gives a tenth to Melchizedek. Jacob just makes this as a kind of a general, how generous am I going to be to you, God? If you give me all these things, I'll give a tenth back to you. Whatever became of that, I don't know. So, what do some of the rest of you think? What do you make of Jacob at this point? He's kind of a mixed sort of guy. And it gets worse, doesn't it? So we're not told then about the rest of his journey, except that he knew where he was going and he arrives there. Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. These are not, I mean, you say, who are the Jews here? There are no Jews here. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are not Jews. They're just people that God has picked out, and he's going to make a new family among humanity of them for his own purposes. But their family back in Padan Aram or back in Haran have maybe a little more awareness of God in their lives than the people around them who are open idolaters. But they're a long ways from really being God's people. But anyway, he comes to this land of the eastern people. And now we have these dramatic stories of Jacob. When he arrives there, outside of town, there's a well. That's pretty normal. They dug a well, and then the town grew up close to it. So he sees this well, and the well here must have been kind of an artesian well or something, that the water is right up at the top of it. And there's a big flat rock covering the mouth of the well to protect it. And he sees shepherds there, and they've got their flocks of sheep, separate flocks of sheep, and he sees the sheep laying there waiting to be watered. And there's this stone over the mouth of the well. So the idea, then the writer explains to us that when the sheep are all around, the shepherds all get together, and together they lift the rock off, they water the sheep, then they put the rock back on. Jacob asks the shepherds. Now, Jacob is not a person who's lacking in self-confidence. He has a pretty healthy ego. So he's a stranger here, and yet he sort of takes charge. He says to the shepherds, he calls them my brothers. Brothers is a broad title. He obviously doesn't mean this literally. He means we're kinsmen. We're of the same kind of family group, so we're brothers. He says to them, brothers, my brothers, where are you from? And they say, we're from Haran. That's the city he's looking for, they replied. He said to them, do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson? Yes, we know him, they answered. Then Jacob said, is he well? Yes, he is, they said. And here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep. Rachel is not the oldest of the family, we find out later. But she's the shepherdess. She apparently, if there are brothers, we find out there are brothers later. They're younger. So Rachel is taking this small group of sheep that belonged to her father Laban, taking them to water and to pasture. So now he sees Rachel, and we're going to find out that this is kind of love at first sight, that this is another one of these very beautiful women in this family, but also very strong women. Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, they're all very strong-minded women. Let me make a little side comment here. I think that under when people are close to God, they treat each other well. And I would say that women in lands dominated by Christianity are much better off than women in lands dominated by the Muslims or the Hindus or some other group. And yet there's kind of an ancient tradition that's just natural. The men are stronger physically. The men assume the role of getting the food and stuff. The women are caring for the children. This is kind of a natural thing. So, if you have the idea, and every now and then you read, well, in ancient times, women were just nothing. The men are everything. That's really not true. Sarah says to Abraham, I'm not having a child, so you take my servant girl and have a child by her. And Abraham says, okay. So Sarah had a lot of influence. How about Rebecca? Did she have influence? Was she just a nothing in the family? Oh, no. Rebecca was a very strong-minded woman who has a lot of influence, some of it good, some of it bad. Now here's Rachel. Rachel is out taking care of the sheep. You say, well, that should be men's work. No, apparently not. So anyway, Jacob says, how come you're not watering these sheep? The sun's high in the sky. They need to be getting out to pasture. Interesting that Jacob feels like he can tell the shepherds how to do their job, even though he's a stranger in their area. So anyway, what Jacob does when he sees Rachel and her sheep and knows that this is the family he's looking for, Jacob may be a homeboy, but he's no weakling. He's no, doormat. He himself is strong enough that he moves the stone, waters Rachel's sheep, and then he talks to Rachel, and he finds out that she indeed is from the family that he's looking for. Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and Laban's sheep. He sees the sheep. There's always this materialism in the background of this. He went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. Okay. I guess men are not supposed to cry, but back then I guess it was all right for men to cry. So what's he weeping about? We find out later that he's fallen very much in love with this girl, but he's weeping because he's found the place he's supposed to be and he's found the girl he's looking for. He's weeping for joy, for relief. But anyway, I'm not sure what Rachel made of this guy who kisses her and weeps aloud. He had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and a son of Rebekah. So she ran and told her father. There's this guy at the well who watered the sheep, and he says he's Rebekah's son. Now here's Laban. We're going to get to know Laban. Laban, Rachel's brother, Rebekah's brother and Rachel's father. No, I don't think that's right. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him. This is still European tradition. Men kiss each other on the cheeks. So he kissed him and brought him to his home. And there Jacob told him all the things. Now, think of the stories that Jacob was telling. Did he tell Laban, oh, I tricked my brother out of the birthright and the blessing, and now I'm the head of the family? Told him all these things. Then Laban said to him, you are my own flesh and blood. Uncle Laban, you're such a wonderful guy. Really? Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month. Laban said to him, just because you're a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be. I don't know how much work Jacob had been doing. Maybe he had immediately started helping with the sheep and things, but Uncle Laban is not one to say, this guy is strong, he's got a lot of ability. I think I need to take charge here. What should your wages be? If you name wages, then I'm the boss and you're working for me. So, now we're told that Laban has two daughters. The older one is Leah, and the younger one is Rachel. And Rachel is beautiful, but Leah has weak eyes. I never was able to quite figure that out, but all the commentators tell me that this was kind of a way to say, well, she really wasn't much to look at, but she had nice eyes. I'm not sure. Weak eyes, it says. It does seem from the way the text goes on that Rachel is the beauty in the family and Leah is not as attractive. Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel, and he said, I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel. Now, I don't know whether that was a good deal or not, but Laban thought it was a good deal. I'm told by the archaeologists that it was tradition among all these people that by now, the bride price, that if somebody was going to give you their daughter that they'd raised, you paid a price. I'm also told by the archaeologists that the idea of this bride price was that it was set aside and kept. It was a kind of an assurance that the daughter would have still something to go back to if all else failed. Anyway, Jacob has nothing to give as a bride price except his labor. And so the 7 comes up so often in the Bible. He says, I'll work 7 years for you if I can marry your daughter. And Laban says, oh, it's better that I give her to you than to some other man. He's not gonna get too far out on a limb here. Stay here with me. So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, and now this is that beautiful statement that we like, and I'm running out of time. That they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, I've been watching the calendar. I've worked for you 7 years, so give me my wife now. And Laban says, my time is completed. I want to lie with her. Don't be too offended by that. It's just the way things are. So Laban brought together all the people, and they had a feast. We're going to have a wedding here. We're going to have a feast. The feast has more meaning socially than just eating some food. But that evening, when the evening came, he took his daughter Leah and gave her to Jacob. Now, from the first time I read this story in college years until now, I'm not sure how he got away with this. And yet, they're feasting and they're drinking, and it gets late, and there's the bridal bedroom, and so it's probably dark in there. And Jacob is so carried away with all this, he doesn't seem to notice the difference until the morning. But here's Uncle Laban. Now, J. Vernon McGee says, there's kind of a principle here, that he quotes from Galatians 6, that what you sow, you reap. And Jacob got where he was by being tricky, and now he finds somebody who's trickier than he is, and he gets back the kind of thing he was giving. He tricked his father, who was not able to know, so now Laban tricks him when he's not able to know. And in the morning he wakes up and finds out that the bride that he has is Leah, not Rachel. And he goes to Laban and he says, the text says, when morning came, there was Leah. And read a lot into that. So Jacob said to Laban, what is this you've done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Then why did you deceive me? And Laban says, well, it's not our custom for the younger daughter to be married before the older daughter. But serve me another 7 years and you can have Rachel as well. Now, the plural marriage thing is acceptable in their society. But I used to think that he worked 7 more years before he married Rachel, but reading the story carefully, no. There was a week of sort of what we call honeymoon, and then they had another wedding, and he married Rachel, and so now he has both of them as wives. And let me just make the story short here so we can stop, because I'm way short of where I wanted to be, but the time is up. So now there is a kind of presumption here that God is sort of totally in control of childbearing. I don't think we're supposed to believe that that's exactly the case, but we can believe that they believed that that was the case. So Rachel has no children for a long time. She's the beautiful one. She's the loved wife. You'll see that it's always that way, all the way through. Jacob loves Rachel. Leah is just there. She's his wife because he's stuck with her. And she knows that, and he knows that, and it colors the whole thing. But Leah begins to have children very rapidly. He's there for 20 years, the text tells us. And at the end of the 20 years, he has 11 sons and 1 daughter. But of course, this comes about that Leah has like 4 sons in a row, and Rachel says, "But I'm not having any children." She says to Jacob, "What's the matter with you that you don't give me children?" And Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children? It's God's thing to give children, not mine." So now we have kind of a repeat of the Abraham thing, and yet I'm told this was normal. This went on in all these peoples at that day. She says, "Okay," Rachel says, "here's my handmaiden. You can have a child. She will have a child, and then it will be my child." And so Jacob, like Abraham, his grandfather, says, "Okay." And she has 2 children. And then Leah says, "But wait a minute, I've stopped having children now. So you're having children by your handmaid. So I'll give my handmaiden to Jacob also." And she has two boys, all boys. Finally a girl comes along, poor girl. But anyway, so this unfolds, and now Jacob in effect has 4 wives. He has 2 real wives and 2 servants who have been given to him as kind of substitutes for wives. They're not really concubines, and they're really considered wives, but they're considered wives under this ancient system that this goes on, and finally Rachel has a son, Joseph, and Joseph from this time on is the favorite because he's the son of the favorite loved wife. And when Joseph comes along, then Jacob says to Laban, "Okay, time for me to go home. My loved wife has had a son, now it's time for me to go home. I'm ready to go." And Laban says, "Oh, Jacob, when you came along, I was just a guy with a few sheep, and now I'm a prosperous guy because God has blessed you. So please stay. Let's make a deal here." Now, they make a deal, and several times later, Jacob will say, "But you changed the deal 10 times. You kept changing the deal." Laban keeps trying to get what it is that God's giving to Jacob. And so it comes time then that finally Jacob says, I'll leave, and we'll talk about that at the beginning next week, how there's some really puzzling things here about how Jacob gets to have all the flocks and herds, and then the separation between the 2 is very interesting. And then, of course, Jacob's ready to go home. He's grown up, he's a man with a family and wealth, but has he really grown up in his relationship with God? That's what we'll talk about next. So read ahead and see if you have some ideas to share with us about what you think about Jacob. But Jacob is certainly a different story than Abraham and Isaac, and he is the story. He really is the last of the patriarchs, is the story. Genesis goes from Abraham through Isaac quickly and then to Jacob, and Jacob becomes the key story with which the book is moving toward. So that's where we will go next week, and then we'll go on and talk about Joseph, because Joseph becomes the story at the end of the book. So, all right. Any last thoughts or questions? I want to leave you some time for your fellowship time and refreshments. Anything to share? Okay. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the challenge that it is to us, the moral questions, the character questions that it brings up in our minds and our hearts as we read it. Guide us, give us your understanding, so we may take from these formative passages of your word and basic understanding of who you are and what our relationship with you is. So we thank you again and ask your blessing in Jesus' name. Amen.